My name is Rachel Monroe. My father called me the artist burden right in the middle of my brother's engagement party, before over 200 guests. He said it with a champagne glass in hand, a smile on his face, like it was just some harmless joke. But I shattered inside. As the daughter of a wealthy family, but never someone who fit what they celebrated, I had lived my whole life in someone else's shadow, quietly, painfully. Have you ever been dismissed by your own family? Publicly? If you've ever felt that way, I hope you'll share it in the comments. Like and follow the channel to walk with me through this journey, because this story isn't just mine. That very night, my grandmother did something no one in my family could have seen coming. I stood there, my hand gripping my small clutch so tightly that my knuckles turned white. No one in the room spoke up for me. No sympathetic glance from my father, no protective gesture from my mother. They just kept raising their glasses, smiling with guests like I was a smudge on a pristine white tablecloth. I had grown used to feeling out of place. But this was different. This time, he had labeled me a failure. Right under the glow of crystal chandeliers and the soft hum of violins. And he did it with a calm face, as if he were reading a dinner menu. In that moment, everything froze. I heard the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of gossip behind my back, and, most clearly, the pounding of my own heart. I turned to walk away, but before I could take a step, a hand gently rested on my elbow. "Don't leave, my dear," my grandmother Eveline's voice whispered. "Tonight is about you. Don't let anyone take that from you." I turned back to look at her. She stood there, small but steady, her silver hair pinned up, wearing a simple yet elegant navy dress. Her eyes were still as sharp as ever, eyes that had seen through every bit of doubt I carried since I was a little girl. She didn't say anything else, just gave a subtle nod. A nod that said, "Stand your ground, they'll hear your part." But I knew, to get to that moment where she had the courage to take the mic, it had been a long journey, for her and for me. I'm the eldest daughter of the Monroe family, born into silk and expectations. Our lakeside home in Bellevue was the stuff of magazine dreams. Wisteria-covered porches, a sweeping oak staircase like something from an old film, and a grand piano I wasn't allowed to touch unless I had practiced for 3 hours that day. My father, Charles Monroe, founded Monroe and Sons, a luxury real estate development firm. He always said, "A person is measured by what they own and leave behind." In his eyes, assets were the only proof of existence. My mother, Deborah, used to model for upscale beauty brands before becoming the family's standard keeper. Every painting in the house was chosen to match the sofa tones. Every dinner started with soup, and if I ever wore something that clashed with her taste, I'd get a look sharp as a razor. Then there was my brother Brandon, the perfect Monroe child. Groomed like a strategic project since day one. Golf lessons with a private coach at 5. Pitching to my father's board of directors in adult language at 8. It was different. I wasn't good at math. I didn't know how to charm adults, but I loved color. I loved how light filtered through frosted glass to form soft stains on the floor. I could sit for hours drawing my own hand in the mirror and never get bored. When I was 12, one of my sketches was secretly submitted by my art teacher to a statewide competition. I won 3rd prize. When I brought the certificate home, my heart was pounding. My father said nothing. My mother remarked, "That's cute, but don't let drawing interfere with your STEM work." A week later, I found that drawing crumpled in the kitchen trash. I grew up constantly being compared to Brandon. He had achievements. I had a little creative streak. He was taken on a college tour of Harvard in 9th grade. I was forced into extra SAT prep whenever I doodled too much in my notebooks. The only person who never compared me to anyone was my grandmother Evelyn. She didn't live with us. She had a small two-bedroom house over an hour's drive from Seattle. She used to teach literature at a public high school. When I was little, she'd take me for weekends when my parents were off on retreat. In that old house full of books, I first read Frida Kahlo. First painted on the back wall with my bare hands. First heard someone say, "No one gets to tell you how to dream." She was the first to give me proper sketch pads, the first to frame my drawing and hang it in her living room, and it's still there to this day. I once believed that if I just stayed true to myself, my parents would eventually see it. But no. When I turned down a spot at Wharton and took a full-ride art scholarship at the University of Oregon, my mother barely looked me in the eye for 3 months. "Artists always end up starving, Rachel. Don't shame us," she told me that last evening I sat at the family dinner table. Years later, when I opened a small art class for children with disabilities in Portland, I mailed a brochure to my father. He replied with a terse email. "It's a shame you're still living in fantasy." I thought I was numb. Thought nothing they did could hurt me deeper than I'd already felt. But I was wrong. Because tonight, in front of Seattle's upper crust, he called me a failure with a smile. And me? I was ready to walk out of there forever. Until Grandma Evelyn stopped me. "Don't leave. Tonight is yours." I still don't fully understand what she meant, but in that moment I saw something in her eyes. Something greater than pity. It was resolve. She wasn't wearing her usual floral dress. She was in formal evening wear, light makeup, her hair neatly pinned. I had the sudden feeling she'd been planning for this night for a long time. And I never could have imagined what would happen next, how Grandma Evelyn would bring the entire room to a halt with just a tap on the microphone. I remember vividly the moment I stepped into my first apartment in Portland. It was barely anything, low ceiling, peeling walls, creaky wood floors, but it had a north-facing window that caught soft light, and I paid the first month's rent with money I earned sketching portraits for tourists at Riverfront Park. I placed my easel in the middle of the living room. On one side was a fold-out bed, the other a tiny dining table I used to mix paint. For the first time in my life, something felt truly mine, even if that apartment was barely larger than the storage room in my parents' house. After 3 years working at a branding agency in Seattle, I quit. Endless meetings, empty pitches full of slick shapes with no soul. I was wilting inside. One time, I stood in the company bathroom with my hand over my chest just to check if I was still alive, because I couldn't feel anything anymore. I remember calling Grandma Evelyn one rainy evening. I sat on the rooftop, soaked and shivering. "Grandma, I don't know what I'm doing with my life anymore," I said, voice cracking over the phone. She was silent for a moment, then responded in her warm, steady voice. "If you don't know, then that's the first sign you're waking up. The ones who sleep inside the golden box of success, they never ask themselves that question." That sentence became my compass for stepping out of that so-called golden box. He started over. With the little savings I had, I enrolled in night classes at the Oregon branch of the Art Students League. During the day, I worked at a small print shop. At night, I painted until my fingers went numb. My first paintings sold for laughably low prices, barely enough for a Taco Bell dinner. But I remember every person who bought them. I remember the way they looked at my work, like they saw something they couldn't put into words. Little by little, I began getting requests for custom paintings. Family portraits, pet illustrations, memories people wanted to preserve forever. And then one thought kept coming back. If a single painting could soothe someone's pain, could a small art class ease the childhood of kids who had been left behind? That was the beginning of Art Access. I had nothing but a few old easels, discounted paint sets, and the belief that every child carries a voice, just waiting for someone to teach them how to speak with color. I posted flyers on the community center bulletin board, handed them out to grocery stores around the neighborhood. In the first week, only 3 kids showed up, all children of single moms living in nearby subsidized housing. I turned my cramped living room into a classroom. Folding chairs, a whiteboard balanced on two cardboard boxes. The oldest kid was Jordan, 10 years old, never said much. But on the fourth session, she drew a crayon picture of a room full of shadows, with a small lamp resting in the hands of a little girl. I didn't ask questions. I just said, "You drew the light beautifully." Jordan gave a tiny nod, but she came early the next day. I started teaching twice a week. Some days, I didn't have enough money for groceries, but I kept the class going because those kids never missed a session. One evening, I wrote a short newsletter describing the program and emailed it to several nonprofit organizations around Portland for support. I also sent one, probably the last time I still held onto a shred of hope, to my father. I didn't expect a reply. What I didn't see coming was that less than a week later, I received a call from the director of a gallery I'd met at the fall exhibition last year. "Rachel, I hate to say this, but we've decided not to move forward with your portfolio." I was stunned. "May I ask why?" "We received a phone call from Mr. Charles Monroe. He's one of our primary donors. He does not want your name associated with this space." The woman's voice was apologetic but helpless. I hung up, unable to cry. Not because I was rejected. I was used to that. But because this time, my father had entered the little dream I'd been building and crushed it with his influence, like sweeping away a fallen leaf on his doorstep. I sat in silence by the window for hours. Outside it was raining. Portland always had that quiet, cold gentleness. I thought back to the last time I went home, last Christmas, when my mother told me not to wear my too scruffy sweater because it might make the guests uncomfortable. I remembered Brandon seeing me and saying, "Rachel, you still chasing that dream of becoming the next Picasso?" Then laughing. I remembered it all, every word like a blade drawn slowly. But what made me want to disappear completely was an email from my father. Only 3 words. "Don't tarnish the name." 3 words. But it felt like a sentence. I thought about calling Grandma Evelyn, but I didn't. I didn't want her to hear one more bad thing. She was too old. What I didn't know was that while I sat there believing I was completely alone in the world, she was making a plan. A plan that night, at Brandon's engagement party, she began to carry out by stepping up to the microphone and calling my name. Just my name. Not Brandon's sister, not the artist kid. Simply Rachel Evelyn Monroe. And the entire room turned to look. I was still standing there, stunned and hollow, when the microphone buzzed softly. The lively atmosphere, the string quartet, the clinking glasses, the hum of hundreds of guests, faded like a tide retreating. Grandma Evelyn stood on the small platform where my father had just announced he was gifting Brandon the Lake Tahoe estate. The golden light bathed her silver hair like a quiet halo. She didn't need to clink a glass or raise her voice. Just by standing there, straight-backed, microphone in hand with quiet determination, she commanded every gaze. I forgot to breathe. "Forgive me for interrupting this grand celebration," she began, her voice low but clear. "But I believe I'm still lucid enough to say a few words before the next generation decides to speak for me forever." There was a polite chuckle, but no one dared to break the seriousness tucked beneath her gentle tone. "I'm Evelyn Monroe. Perhaps, to many of you here, I'm just the old lady reading books in the garden during the holidays." She smiled, her eyes scanning the room with soft wit. "But I'm also someone who has lived long enough to know that value isn't always what's displayed at the front entrance." I felt my chest tighten, as if something powerful was rising. Hope or fear, I couldn't tell. "Our family," she continued, looking at everyone without flinching, "is well known for wealth, for power. But today, I want to speak about something else. About the one person in this entire extended family who has dared to live truthfully despite giving up recognition, comfort, and sometimes even kinship." My heart stopped. My granddaughter, Rachel Monroe. When she said my name, the room turned in unison. The eyes that had previously passed me by with polite detachment, or worse, quiet pity, now looked at me as though I'd just stepped out of a story they'd never heard. I don't even remember how I walked to her side, only that her hand gripped mine tightly as I stood beside her on the stage. "I've been preparing for this evening," she said, turning to me with a loving gaze, "and I'd like to begin with a story." The room fell into absolute silence. Even the quartet had stopped playing. More than 40 years ago, I was a high school literature teacher, newly married to the Monroe heir. I used to believe that, with patience and love, I could change the way his family saw me. She paused. I knew this story, but not everyone in the room had heard it, at least not from her own lips. Instead, she said, I was seen as a defect in the bloodline. I brought no dowry, didn't come from Ivy League stock, but what hurt the most was that my own son, Charles— She cast a subtle glance toward my father, who stood just a few feet away with a face like stone— slowly learned to measure people's worth by the same cold metrics. There were audible exhales from the crowd, a few murmurs. I kept silent for many years. I thought love meant endurance, until I saw my granddaughter, Rachel, bear those looks, hear those words, and still stand tall. I felt her fingers squeeze mine gently. Rachel is not just a painter, she said, looking directly at the audience. She's created a space where children abandoned by the system, by society, can find their voices through color. That's not a hobby. That's an act of courage. Someone let out a soft "wow" from the back of the room. And so I'd like to formally announce— She took a deep breath. I have established the Evelyn Monroe Art Fund with an initial endowment of $20 million. At that moment, I distinctly heard the sound of a glass shattering somewhere, and several sharp intakes of breath. Rachel will serve as the executive director of this fund, she continued, not only to expand her program, but to build a dedicated art center for underserved communities. I stood frozen. Not even in dreams had I dared imagine a number like that. My father stepped forward, his face pale. "Mother, this isn't the time, and it's not the way." Grandma Evelyn cut him off. "No need to raise her voice. Charles, you chose to publicly announce Brandon's gift in front of 200 people. So allow me to publicly share my acknowledgement of Rachel before the same crowd." I saw my mother standing stiffly nearby, her lips pressed into a bloodless line. Brandon turned his face away, and Charlotte, my brother's fiancée, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Grandma turned to me. "Are you ready to receive this?" I swallowed hard, my voice rasping. I don't know what to say." "I never imagined this day could come." She smiled. "You don't have to say anything, just keep painting, and keep helping others find their voice, the way you found yours." I looked out at the room, nearly 200 people staring at me, but this time there was no disdain, no pity, only silence, waiting. I didn't know what they were thinking. Maybe they still didn't understand why someone like me was given that gift. Maybe they would still whisper behind my back. But in that moment, I didn't care, because for the first time, I was standing in the light, not as background, but to be truly seen. And if you've made it this far, if you've ever had someone believe in you when the whole world turned away, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. And if this journey touched something in you, a buried dream, an old hurt, please like, follow, and share. Because I'm about to tell you what happened after my parents closed the door behind me, and my grandmother opened a brand new one, where I found a part of myself I didn't know existed. I don't clearly remember how I stepped down from the stage. My feet barely touched the ground. Evelyn's announcement still echoed in my mind, like I was walking through a dream too big to comprehend. She hadn't just protected me. She hadn't just validated me. She'd built a bridge between the world I lived in and the one my family had long shut me out of. And she placed me at the helm. I snapped back to reality when my eyes met my father's. He was standing just a few feet away, face frozen. I had never seen him so undone. Not angry, not shouting. Just a hollow kind of emptiness in his gaze. Like he no longer recognized the woman standing next to me. Like I myself was a flawed copy, something beyond his comprehension. Before I could react, Brandon stepped in, quickly pulling Charlotte away. My brother brushed past me like a gust of wind, saying nothing, but he left behind a glance I couldn't quite decipher. Not anger, not disdain, but also not support. It looked like the helplessness of someone witnessing something irreversible. Maybe, in that moment, he realized everything had changed forever. Grandma Evelyn gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Don't look at them," she whispered. "Tonight is your night." I nodded, trying to smile, but my mind was spiraling into something deeper than awe, a quiet fear blooming in my chest. I was afraid I might lose this. That by morning, it would all vanish like mist, that she would change her mind or someone would find a way to undo everything, as if none of it had ever happened. But Grandma didn't let me drown in those thoughts for long. "We have work to do," she said, and with a calm gesture stepped off the stage as if she had simply stated a fact, not overturned the entire power dynamic of the Monroe family. As the two of us left the central area, the crowd began to murmur. Some people smiled at me, cautiously, but without mockery. Others avoided eye contact or turned quickly to chat with someone else, trying to mask their discomfort. People from my parents' social circle often connected through silent consensus. Tonight, Grandma Evelyn had broken that unspoken pact, and I, whether I liked it or not, had become the epicenter of that tremor. "Are you tired?" she asked as we walked down the hallway toward the back patio. I shook my head, though the truth was, I was dazed. "We need to speak privately," she added, "before they drag you into a side room to reframe the narrative." I gave a soft laugh. "You know them too well." "I used to be them," she replied gently. We reached the backyard, where the soft light of garden lanterns spilled over the trees. The noise of the party felt distant now. She pointed to a wrought iron bench beneath a red maple. "Sit, Rachel." I obeyed, my heart pounding like I was bracing for a sequel or an explanation. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope tied with a lavender ribbon. I recognized that color instantly. She always used it to wrap my little birthday gifts back when I preferred colored pencils over dolls. "I wasn't exaggerating when I announced the fun tonight," she began. "But that was only the beginning." I looked at the envelope, then back at her. "Inside," she said, "are legal documents. 3 weeks ago, I signed over the majority of my personal assets, everything outside the Monroe estate, my independent shares, private real estate, and long-term investment portfolios, into a separate protective trust. The sole beneficiary is you." "Sam, you—" My eyes widened. I don't understand." "You don't have to understand all of it right now," she placed a hand over mine. "Just know this isn't a fleeting gift. This is my way of saying I believe in you, that you have the right to steer your own story." I opened the envelope. The documents were neatly arranged, and on top was a handwritten letter from Grandma. I didn't read it right away. I just stared at the familiar handwriting, catching the faint scent of lavender. Instinctively, I remembered the days she used to brew tea for me, listening as I talked about my artistic dreams, while the rest of the family ignored them like childish fantasies that would fade with age. "Art isn't just about beauty," she had once said. "It's a language for those who are never heard. And you learned to speak it, then taught it to those who needed it most. That, in my eyes, is a greater accomplishment than any contract Brandon has ever signed." My throat tightened. I squeezed her hand. I don't plan to live forever, Rachel, she whispered. And time isn't what it used to be. But I need to see you stand strong before I let go. I rested my head on her shoulder, feeling small and powerful at the same time. And from this moment on, she murmured, your path won't be a lonely one anymore. I nodded. What I didn't know was that, in the house behind us, my father was already calling the family attorney in the middle of the night. I didn't know that a few guests had started phoning the press. I didn't know. But Grandma did. And she had prepared for everything. About 40 minutes later, Grandma Evelyn and I returned to the main room. The party had regained some of its rhythm, but not all. There was a subtle hesitance in the air, like everyone was watching the next act of a play. They were no longer sure who the lead character was. My mother stood near the wine table, her smile still fixed, but her eyes stiff. She was chatting with a group of older women in ivory satin gowns, but her gaze tracked every move Grandma and I made. I recognized that look. The look of someone losing control, scanning for any opportunity to take it back. My father was no longer in the party room. I couldn't find him anywhere. Grandma gave my hand one last squeeze and veered off to speak with a few of her longtime guests. I figured she was giving me some space. Quietly, I slipped down the left hallway, hoping to find a quiet corner where I could read her letter, which was still tucked in my purse. But before I could find that corner, a familiar voice called from behind. Got a minute? I turned around. Brandon. My brother stood a few steps away, his expression unsure, a little hesitant in a way I'd never seen before. He was no longer the confident Brandon, the one who always held his head high at family parties. He looked like a man holding something too heavy inside. I nodded. We walked to the downstairs study, the room I used to retreat to when Mom scolded me, where I once hid my sketchbooks in the third drawer from the bottom. No one came in here but Grandma, because the lighting was dim and the books were too dusty for guests. Brandon shut the door behind us, then turned to face me, pausing as if choosing his words. I know you think I've been on their side, he finally said, and you're not wrong. I let them do it. Let them label you. I believed what they said about you. I said nothing. I wanted to hear it all. Brandon had never been one to share his feelings. But tonight, he swallowed hard. When Grandma spoke, I realized I've been living my whole life inside a script I didn't write. And unlike you, I've never had the courage to step outside of it. I let out a quiet breath. Part of me wanted to be angry, to say he had every chance to understand me long before Grandma spelled it out. But a bigger part of me, one too familiar with silence and distance, just felt relieved. You don't have to explain, I said softly. You don't owe me that. No, Brandon shook his head. I need to say it, because if I don't now, I might never get the chance. I looked at him. Suddenly the man in front of me wasn't the chosen younger brother. He was someone who had just woken up from a decades-long dream. Do you remember, Brandon said, when I was 14, I told Dad I wanted to study marine biology. I was obsessed with whales. I read for hours about ocean ecosystems. But then, after one dinner, Dad pulled me into the office and said, Monroe, sons, don't research fish. You'll study finance and learn to run this empire. I nodded slightly. Of course I remembered. He cried that night, the only time I ever saw him cry. It was under the stairs, eyes swollen, and Mom blamed it on allergies. After that, I threw away all my marine biology books. I tried not to think about the ocean anymore. I studied everything they wanted, and over time, I forgot I ever had a choice. Brandon gave a bitter laugh. But you didn't. You held on to that part of yourself. Somehow, you didn't let them take it. I lowered my head. I never felt brave. I just felt alone, in pain, and constantly doubting myself for years. but I understood what he meant. Brandon looked like he had something more to say, then paused. "There's one more thing," he said. "I think you should know about Dad." I looked up. Right after Grandma finished speaking, he called the family lawyer. I overheard it walking past the library. He wants to find a way to revoke or invalidate part of the inheritance decision. He thinks Grandma isn't in her right mind. A chill ran down my spine. Brandon continued, "But what she did is completely legal. I believe she planned this for a long time with full legal counsel. I just want you to be careful. Dad won't back down easily." I nodded, my chest tightening. The feeling of being threatened by the very person who gave you life is a pain that's hard to describe. It's not quite anger, not quite sadness. It's like a fog seeping into every cell. Cold, silent, and numbing. "Thank you," I said, meeting Brandon's eyes. He gave a slight nod, then turned to leave. But before opening the door, he turned back. "If you need anything, I mean, if there's any way I can help, I'm here." For the first time in years, I believed he meant it. I stayed in that room a little longer. Looking around, I saw the small portrait I painted when I was 16, a woman swimming in the dark sea, with only the moonlight as her companion. I'd hidden it behind the bookshelf all through high school, afraid it would be discovered. Now, the light from the desk lamp hit it just right, making it seem alive. With a trembling hand, I pulled Grandma Evelyn's letter from my bag. It was time to read the words she hadn't been able to say aloud. And also time for me to understand what I was stepping into. Not a battle for money, but a fight to preserve the most precious thing she had given me: belief in myself. I opened Grandma's letter right there at the old wooden desk in the study, where the soft amber lamp cast a gentle glow across each line of her handwriting. Her script was still steady, sharp, and calm, just like her. "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, it means things have gone as planned, or at least not off course from the months of preparation I've put in. You may be feeling overwhelmed, anxious, even lost. I understand. I felt just like you. Inside a house that never felt like mine, among people who always looked at me like a blot on silk. But I'm not writing this to remind you of pain. I'm writing to remind you that you are not alone. You have lived more courageously than anyone in this family ever dared. You didn't just choose to live authentically. You've given others that ability too. And that's why I chose you, not just to inherit assets, but to carry on a legacy." I lowered the letter for a moment, swallowing hard. Every word carried her breath, as if she were right beside me, reading in that warm, familiar voice. There was one more item in the envelope: a hand-drawn sketch. She'd done it on cream notepaper in blue ink. It was a floor plan of a building. A main exhibition hall, 2 large classrooms, 3 small studios, a library, and a central garden courtyard. I recognized it instantly. This was the arts center she had envisioned. Not just a vague idea, but a detailed design. To her, art wasn't just about bursts of inspiration. She'd built this the way people build schools, libraries, a place to shape future generations. I folded the paper, tucked the letter and sketch into my bag, and held it close to my chest. Then I left the study, my heart heavy. Not with fear, but with something solid, like a form finally taking shape inside me. 3 days after the party, I went to New York. Not to escape my parents, though that would have been understandable, but because Grandma Evelyn had set everything in motion. A meeting with an architect in Brooklyn she'd worked with since last year, an appointment with an independent attorney in Manhattan to finalize the foundation's paperwork, and, most notably, a tour of an old building in Chelsea she'd had her eye on for some time, a red brick warehouse that used to be a printing press, now up for sale. I stepped into that building on a Tuesday afternoon as the late autumn sunlight filtered through nearly 10-foot-high windows, casting reflections on the old hardwood floors. I heard my own footsteps echo, And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on ground no one could take from me. "Your grandmother talked about you a lot," said the architect Marcia as we walked down the hallway together. "She called you a light that doesn't flare but endures." I've never heard anyone describe family like that before. I smiled softly. Grandma had a way with words that made people go quiet and think. Marcia pointed to the far end of the ground floor, where the light formed a stripe of color like a river. "This will be the children's space, a multi-purpose studio. We can add sliding doors that open to an outdoor art garden." I nodded. My mind was already arranging color blocks, imagining the kids, ones who used to draw with worn-out markers in my tiny apartment, now having room to breathe, to create, to grow. That afternoon, I met with the attorney at a small office on the 11th floor of a building near Union Square Park. Grandma Evelyn hadn't left a single detail unfinished. All the investment transfers had been completed, moved into the foundation under the oversight of a board she selected herself. A retired fine arts professor, a nonprofit law expert, and, most surprisingly, Charlotte, Brandon's fiancée. I asked the attorney, "Charlotte? My grandmother really trusted her?" "She was very clear," the lawyer said. "She told me, 'Don't let the family name blind you to someone's real compassion.'" I didn't say anything else, but I began to understand that Grandma saw people, not just the roles they played. That evening, back at the hotel, I opened my laptop and started drafting plans for the center's first exhibition. The theme appeared clearly in my mind: the first voice. I wanted this exhibit to be a place where kids could speak through their art, to tell the stories they'd never dared to share, fragments that might be messy but truthful, voices heard for the very first time. I wrote each of my former students a handwritten letter. No emails, no texts. I wanted each word to carry breath. "Do you remember when you painted a tiger with flour and crayons? You said it was your fear of being bullied. I still remember that painting, and I want others to see it too." After midnight, I fell asleep at the desk, my hand resting on a stack of drafts. But in my light sleep, I saw Grandma Evelyn standing in a glowing white space, her hands gently on my shoulders. She didn't speak, she just nodded. As if she were still here. As if I never had to walk alone. The grand opening of the Evelyn Monroe Art House took place on a crisp Saturday morning at the end of winter. The sky was clear, sunlight sparkling like tiny shards of glass on the brick-paved street. I stood in the main hall, still not fully believing everything around me was real. Exposed brick walls kept just as they were, polished wood floors, and LED strips tracing the edges of the artwork being hung. Inside, I felt a strange blend of nerves and emotion. The first piece I chose to hang at the entrance was by Malik, an 11-year-old Haitian boy who had once joined my tiny class back in Portland. He'd painted a house split in two, one half in ruins, the other beneath a brilliant blue sky, with a child standing in the middle, arms stretched wide. I remembered when he handed me that painting, he said, "I think you have to carry both sides if you want to run toward the sun." Today, his painting was the first thing people saw when entering the space, and I couldn't think of anything more meaningful. Groups of visitors started arriving at 9 a.m. Some were parents of my former students, others were friends from the local art community, journalists, and many people I'd never met. Drawn by a write-up in the Village Voice or a segment on the local news earlier that week, I hadn't expected this much attention. A well-dressed woman in a gray wool coat approached while I was speaking with a group of volunteers. "You're Rachel, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes full of sincerity. "I just wanted to thank you. My granddaughter, her name's Lucy. She never smiled in any class before joining yours. Now she draws at home, and every week she makes me sit down and look at what she's made." I gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you for bringing Lucy to art. Without her, that class wouldn't have been the same." She smiled, touched my arm lightly, and walked away. Around 10 a.m., I saw a familiar figure standing near the central hall, gazing at Jordan's painting. A monochrome oil piece depicting a pair of mud-covered shoes next to a shattered door. It was Brandon. I walked over. He wore a long brown coat, hands in his pockets, but his face looked brighter than I had ever seen it before. "You got here earlier than I expected," I said gently. Brandon turned to me and nodded. "I couldn't sleep. Felt like if I didn't show up on time, I'd miss something important." We stood side by side in silence for a moment. "I used to think art was just pretty decoration," Brandon said, his eyes still fixed on the painting. "But today, I think, it's more like a place where you store the things you can't put into words." I turned to look at him. "That's exactly what it is. And sometimes, it's the only thing that keeps a person tethered to themselves." Brandon smiled, saying nothing more. But that was enough. In that look, I could tell my brother was truly beginning to see the world in a different way. Charlotte arrived about 10 minutes later, accompanied by a friend who worked in community education. She brought with her a proposal for a program connecting high school students with senior artists in a mentor-mentee model. Charlotte had now shed the image of future Monroe daughter-in-law and become a true partner. Step by step, she had proven Grandma Evelyn right to trust her. By noon, the main gallery was full. I was invited to give a short speech before everyone transitioned to the workshop area. I stepped up onto a small platform at the end of the hall, stood before the microphone, and looked out at the crowd. In it were familiar faces and people I had never seen before. But they were all here, for one shared reason: to witness something real. I hadn't prepared a formal speech, just scribbled a few notes in the palm of my hand, but as I stood there, I realized I didn't need them anymore. I used to think I had to walk away from everything in order to begin something that truly belonged to me, I began. But it turns out, sometimes, what belongs to us the most is what we thought we weren't allowed to keep. I paused for a breath. My grandmother, Evelyn Monroe, taught me that courage isn't shouting to prove you exist. It's continuing to do what you believe is right, even when no one else is standing with you. I turned to look at the portrait of my grandmother displayed prominently on the center wall. A large acrylic painting of her sitting on a wooden bench, holding a copy of the bell jar, her hair tied up, her gaze distant yet calm. "This center isn't just a space," I continued. "It's a place where kids and grown-ups can find their inner voice again. A place where we don't have to be perfect to be seen." The entire room applauded, not loudly, but warmly, like a hug, like quiet but deep recognition. As I stepped down from the platform, I saw my father. He was standing near the entrance quietly, not with my mother, not with anyone, just alone. I looked at him, uncertain of what would come next, but he nodded slightly, more a tired gesture than an acknowledgement. Then he turned around and left the room without a word. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to anymore. 1 week after the center's grand opening, I received word that Brandon had officially submitted his resignation as vice president at Monroe & Sons. I was sitting in the small faculty room on the second floor, reorganizing a box of markers for the afternoon class, when he called. His voice was even, but I could hear the release in every breath. "I submitted it," he said simply. "Dad hasn't responded yet. Maybe he'll pretend it never arrived, or maybe he'll call one of his usual family meetings. But this time, I won't be there for it." I let my hand rest on an orange marker. "Are you sure?" I asked. "More sure than anything I've ever done." Brandon paused, then added, "Actually, I was sure the night you gave your speech, just didn't finish writing it until today." I didn't need to ask, "Writing what?" I already knew. Some things need to be written by hand, laid out on paper to become real in your heart. A few days later, he showed up at the center with a large cardboard box. "Memories," he said, flipping open the lid. Inside were items from his old office. a Young Leader of the Year trophy, a framed photo with Dad at the Palm Beach branch ribbon cutting, and a few leather-bound notebooks stamped with the company logo. "Where do you think I should put all this?" he asked, half joking. I smiled. "You could use it as the base for your first art project. A sculpture on freedom, maybe." Brandon laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from him in months. After that, he began coming to the center more often, not as a guest but as part of the team. At first, he helped with logistics, organizing paints, fixing hanging frames. But soon after, he volunteered to lead STEM tutoring sessions for the older kids. Something none of us had expected. "You know how to teach?" I teased when I saw him preparing a lesson plan on his iPad. "You forgot I wanted to be a biology teacher in middle school?" he pouted. "Before I got steered into being a future leader, remember?" "You mean forced," I said. Brandon shrugged, not denying it. I watched him during his first class. The kids loved him immediately. He had a way of explaining dry concepts like resistance and molecules with life and clarity. He told them stories about glowing coral reefs, whales using sonar for navigation, and how mantis shrimp could see color spectrums that humans couldn't even imagine. I saw a different Brandon, a version that should have existed long ago if only our family hadn't tried to shape us all into one cold, narrow line. One evening, after the center had closed, the two of us sat in the gallery, looking at the photos being prepped for our second exhibition titled Reform. "What do you think?" I asked. Brandon leaned on the table, studying a photo taken by a boy named Ezra of a broken window looking out onto an empty lot where an old housing project used to be. "I think it looks like us," he said quietly. "We thought we were looking out at the world, but really, we were just staring through a shattered frame." I said nothing. Some things don't need a reply. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. Her handwriting was still strong, but some of the ink had smudged. Maybe from shaky hands or maybe from tears. I couldn't be sure. "Rachel, you might think I never listened to you. Maybe that's true, or at least it was true for a very long time. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about the exhibition the other day. I can't unsee your grandmother's image on that wall, painted by your own hand, gentle, yet so solid it demands your gaze. I used to believe success was something measurable, but now I wonder if I've missed the things that can't be measured, and yet are worth far more. I don't know if you even want to forgive me, but I'll come to the next exhibit if you'll allow it." I read the letter over and over again. I rested my hand on the part that said Mom. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just felt like a hollow space inside me had slowly started to fill with something nameless. Charlotte came into my office that afternoon. She brought a draft proposal for expanding the center into a neighboring borough. "We've been approached by the Bloomfield Foundation," she said. "They're willing to fund it if we can show sustainable impact in the first year." I nodded without hesitation. "We can do it, not because we have money, but because we have purpose." Charlotte smiled, but her eyes held something serious. "Rachel, you know, Evelyn believed in you not because you stood against your family. She believed in you because you didn't carry hate. You chose to build something new, not burn down the old." I bowed my head. I didn't know what to say. But in my heart, I thought, maybe that's the only reason all of this could even keep going. Not to win against someone, but to not lose yourself along the way. The center's second exhibit, titled Rebirth, opened on a spring afternoon when buds began breaking through bark and sunlight poured through the tall gallery windows like a warm stream. The atmosphere that day was different from our first opening. There was no more cautious excitement or tentative steps. People walked in as if they'd known this place for a long time, a shared home for voices that had once been lost. I stood in the corner of the room, quietly watching each child step forward to present their work. They didn't recite from memory. They didn't tremble. They told stories, their own stories, about dreams, fears, even wounds they'd once hidden. Elijah, a boy who used to get teased for his stutter, had created a series of murals depicting broken sounds. The scream that couldn't form, the laugh that got cut off, the sob swallowed in the throat. "I don't hate my voice anymore," Elijah said to the crowd, "because if I didn't have this voice, I couldn't have painted these things." There was a moment of silence before the applause came. I stood in the back, my heart finally exhaling after years of holding its breath. After the exhibit, I returned to the small office upstairs. The old wooden desk was still where I kept all the original sketches of the center. Late afternoon light slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Brandon knocked and walked in, carrying 2 cups of ginger tea. "Got 5 minutes?" he asked. I nodded. He sat across from me, placed the cup in front of me, and looked out the window. "I ran into Dad this morning," he said. "Wasn't planned, just happened at the bookstore near Bryant Park." I was a bit surprised, but said nothing. He was still wearing that old gray coat, carrying his leather notebook and headed straight to the finance section, Brandon said. "I was just going to walk by, but then, I don't know why, I stopped." "Did he say anything?" I asked. "Not much. He just looked at me, gave a small nod, then turned away. But when he left a book on the counter. It was called Leadership in the Age of Compassion. And on the cover was a sticky note. Not everything has to be cold to be respected." I looked at Brandon. He shrugged. "I think he's trying to do something, not an apology, but the closest thing he knows how." I wasn't sure whether to feel relief or sadness. But I understood. Some people spend a lifetime just trying to admit a mistake, and even then, the way they show it might not be what you expect. The next day, I received an email from the Bloomfield Foundation. They had officially approved funding for Phase 2 of the center, expansion into the Bronx and the creation of an art-based healing program for students who had experienced loss. When I read the confirmation letter, I thought of Grandma Evelyn. I remembered the last time I sat beside her, her hand resting gently on mine, her voice steady. "You don't need to shout to change the world. You just need to stay the course." I stepped into the hallway, where her portrait hung at the top of the stairs. It was a painting done by one of my students from an old photo. She sat in the middle of a lavender garden, her gaze soft but resolute. Beneath the portrait, embroidered in thread, were the words, "Inheritance is not money, it is the ability to awaken the good in others." That night, I stayed at the center alone. A soft rain began falling over New York. I opened the window to hear it tapping gently on the skylight. The sound reminded me of the day I left my old home. A damp summer morning, dragging my suitcase to the bus station, my heart weighed down like stone. Back then, I thought I had lost everything. But now, in this room, I felt more at peace than ever before. Brandon sent me a short video clip by text. I opened it. Kids were playing in the STEM classroom. A little girl was programming a tiny robot while the others cheered her on. On the wall behind them was a hand-painted slogan, "You are allowed to begin again." I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair. Moments like that, small as they are, let me know everything I've done has meaning. I didn't become heir to my father's company. I don't live in the luxurious mansion Brandon once did. I don't have a seat on any board of directors. But I have real people, real stories, and a place where all of us can simply be who we are. And to me, that is the highest form of revenge. Living a life they never believed I could, not with anger, but with conviction. Not to fight back, but to move forward. Someday, when I'm older, I'll tell all of this to someone, a student, a friend, or maybe another young woman standing at the edge of a life-defining decision. And I'll say to her, live not to prove anything to anyone. Live so you never have to hurt yourself again. What do you think of the choice I made? If it were you, would you have the courage to walk away from a family that never accepted you? To start over with nothing but the quiet belief that you deserve a different life? I know everyone has their own answer. Maybe you've lived something similar, or maybe you're right in the middle of it. Either way, I hope you'll share your thoughts. I truly want to listen, because stories like these matter when they're told. If you care about emotional journeys revolving around family, connection, and silent resilience, follow this channel to hear more stories to come. Sometimes, in the fragments of someone else's life, we find pieces of our own.